Welcome to Reinvent and the Reinvent American Foreign Policy series. I'm Pete Lyden. I'm the founder of Reinvent, and I'll be moderating the conversation today. Now, this entire series started with the notion that the United States had reached a moment in its history that really required a fundamental rethinking of American foreign policy. Our partners in this series, the Plowshares Fund, as well as three key individuals, Guy Saperstein, Dan Berger, and Katrina Vander Heuvel, all three of them and the Plowshares shared this idea that we're at a kind of interesting, if not unique moment in time. The past policies in our foreign policies of American kind of unilateral actions and relying primarily on a, let's say, a military first option, or at least a military often option, had proven at best kind of ineffective and at worst kind of disastrous. In the world of the 20th, when a lot of these policies and these strategies were evolved back in the 20th century. So we're facing in the coming decades very different security threats and very different challenges that really call for a different kind of foreign policy. Now, this roundtable today, in a way, is essentially encapsulates the entire spirit of the series. It's early in the series, and what we're actually doing here is really stepping back, really taking stock, looking at the big picture and looking ahead with the long view of what's coming next. What we want to do in this conversation is we want to look at, let's say, several things. We want to think, what are the actual security threats that the United States is going to face in the coming decades? And what are the big challenges that we really got to wrap our heads around? Secondly, what are the actual national security interests of the United States right now? And even beyond our security, what are the kind of aspirational goals that we want to carry out in the world in the coming decades? And the third is, what would a new kind of American foreign policy look like? Particularly one that's more based on cooperation and collective action in what is going to certainly be a much increasingly kind of integrated world. So to help us with that, we've got a terrific group here for this roundtable, and I think the best way to do it is to go around the roundtable and have everyone introduce themselves briefly and say, what do they bring to the table? So Robert Scheer, do you want to start off and give a little bit of your background? Many folks know you, but how would you frame your contribution here?
Well, my main job is to have a bull detector, and I realized at a very early age I had made the mistake, or was the opportunity when I was in graduate school, and I was in the Center for Chinese Studies at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and my summer vacation I went to teach at City College, and then I went to Cuba. And I came back and I teamed up with a guy named Maurice Zeitlin, who ended up being a professor at sociology at UCLA, and we tried to figure out, why is the U.S. all geared up to go to war with Castro, and why is this happening? And we never had been able to answer that question, and now here we are, Cuba's being opened up for tourism and multinational corporations, and no one has provided an answer of, why was that trip necessary? Why was it important to spend, a half century isolating that small island? And so my basic take on foreign policy is that we don't have adults watching the store, number one. Secondly, I would return to the wisdom of George Washington in his farewell address, which was, beware the impostures of pretended patriotism, and his warning, basically, and that of all of the founders, that you can't be both an empire and a representative republic at the same moment. If you're going to be an empire, you're going to go the way of Rome, you're going to go the way of England, and France, and Spain, and if you want to have a representative government, you need an informed public, and you can't be meddling around in everybody else's business.
That's a good little intro and a little insight into where you're going to go with the ideas here. Charles, why don't you jump in and tell us a little bit about yourself and what you bring to the table?
Thank you, Peter. Hello, I'm Charles Knight. Presently, I'm a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C. However, I live and work in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Today, I'm in my home office. I am co-founder of the Project on Defense Alternatives, Our mission as a project is to advance national and international security policies that seek to reconcile goals of progressively reducing the use of armed force, promoting reliable and sustainable defenses, lowering resource investment in armed forces, and finally building international institutional strength to resolve conflict non-violently. Now, particular perspectives and appreciations I might bring to the conversation today are of the importance of mutual regard among nations for each other's security concerns, the serious failures of U.S. foreign and military policy since 1990, and finally, the undemocratic nature of our governance of foreign and military policy, and the failures of our national leadership to address this problem. Our nation desperately needs a new foreign policy. This is a very important conversation to have, and I very much look forward to it. Thank you.
Good to hear from you. Robert, we have a second Robert. We're going to go with Bob. Bob, why don't you introduce yourself and tell a little bit about what you bring to the table?
My name is Robert Naiman. I'm the policy director at Just Foreign Policy. We formed in early 2006 with a particular focus on avoiding war with Iran and pushing the U.S. to resolve the dispute with Iran over its nuclear program through diplomacy. But more broadly, our focus is pushing the U.S. away from use of force, threat of the use of force, trying to prevent, end, and limit wars. And we do that by thinking about how to move the ball in Washington in ways that can engage people outside of Washington, ways for public opinion or parts of public opinion to engage in moving the ball in Washington. My background before that, I'm 50 years old. I've been working on trying to reform U.S. foreign policy, although not necessarily using that language, since I was a freshman in college in the 1980s. So I think what that experience brings is the full range of different kinds of things that one might be engaged in to bring to bear to that project. I've been arrested for civil disobedience. I was involved in the sanctuary movement in the 1980s, the Free South Africa movement. I lived in Palestine, was a student at Birzeit University during the first Intifada. I've also been an elected official, a union organizer, and I try to bring all these perspectives to bear as we try to move pragmatically, step by step, moving the ball forward in the direction of the very different U.S. foreign policy that we all hope to see, which I don't, at the age of 50, expect ever to live to see, but I would consider myself successful if I can stop a few wars and prevent a few wars.
Well, then you're welcome perspective in the conversation here. Heather, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit? Oops, you're muted. You got to unmute there, Heather. Sorry.
Not bad. Yep. So much for the technology. I'm Heather Hurlburt. I run the New Models of Policy Change project at New America in Washington, where we look at how to get anything done in the U.S. political system under conditions of intense partisan polarization. I came to this work after spending more than 20 years working in U.S. foreign policy and understanding just how thoroughly polarization and the gap between, on the one hand, political conversations, and on the other hand, what Americans think and understand about the world, and at the same time, the gap going the other way between partisan point scoring and what's actually going on in the world impairs us from getting anything done. My background is that I started out, I was going to be a Sovietologist, but the Soviet Union collapsed just about the time I finished college. I spent several years working for Congress and working in Europe at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, so had the good chance to be in a new field at the moment it emerged and got to do a lot of work on conflict resolution and prevention. in the former Soviet Union, former Yugoslavia, Eastern Europe. Came home to work in the Clinton administration, served in the State Department as a speechwriter to Secretary Warren Christopher, Secretary Madeleine Albright, was on the Secretary's policy planning staff during a stretch of time that included the wars in the former Yugoslavia. Went to the White House and worked for President Bill Clinton the last year plus of his time there, also as a speechwriter. Then had a string of advocacy jobs, having realized that having people of goodwill on the inside was not nearly enough to overcome the structural and ideological problems with American foreign policy. Worked at the International Crisis Group, at what's now the One Campaign, did a bunch of political speech writing again, and then came back to Washington to run the National Security Network, which was founded on the idea that progressives, we often don't come into politics because we care about foreign policy. We're often afraid to talk about it. We often, frankly, fall back on conservative talking points because we think those are safe. So spent a number of years basically trying, again, to close the gap between what progressives believe and what progressive office holders think is safe or smart to say. And since then have been working in this climate of how do we make it possible, even when you have, as I think will come up over and over again this afternoon, enormous agreement across political lines. How do we jump over kind of bad political habits of thought to get anything done?
Wow, interesting. That'll be great in the mix here. Gareth, why don't you wrap it up and we'll jump into the conversation. Oops, you're muted there, Gareth.
Okay, got it. Thank you very much, Peter, and thanks to Reinvent for mounting this effort, which I think is really very important and very useful. What do I bring to the table? Well, I've been, like Bob and Heather, I was a regional, I started out in graduate school as a regional specialist on Southeast Asia. And the reason that I got into that field was, of course, there was a certain unpleasantness in Southeast Asia going on at the time that I went into graduate school, which was the war in Vietnam. And I was very much opposed to it even before the war started. And in fact, I very quickly became an activist trying to use my knowledge of Vietnam, Vietnamese history and politics, to try to bring light to the subject and to oppose the U.S. war in all three countries of Indochina during the 1970s. I was co-director of the Indochina Resource Center from 1974 to 76 and was involved in trying to end the war through legislation in that position. Just to make a longer story short, I really didn't acquire, I think, the perspective that I now bring to the table about U.S. foreign policy until three things really converged around 2005. The United States was trying to consolidate its control over Iraq, having invaded in 2003. I had just finished my book on Vietnam, and basically discovered from that writing the book that the problem of U.S. war in Vietnam was really not just the predilections of who was in the White House, the president himself, but rather was a problem of a system that involved all of these senior national security advisors representing various national security institutions in Washington who were pressing for war. So I brought that perspective then to Iraq and all of the wars that the United States has been fighting since then. And then the third thing is that I found my way back into journalism again, having been a journalist during the time I was working on my PhD dissertation in South Vietnam in 1971, and then abandoning that, I came back to it in 2005, and that's what I've been doing ever since then, being an investigative journalist, but also writing analysis of U.S. Military policy in particular in the Middle East, but also trying to cover the national security state itself. And my ambition really is to write the book about the nature of the national security state in the coming years.
All right. Well, thanks for coming. As by the way, for those who are watching, as terrific as the group is here, as smart as they all are, we say around here, nobody's as smart as everybody. We encourage people to ask questions, add their ideas on our website, reinvent.net. If you're watching in other places like YouTube or other places, you can always tweet using the hashtag Reinvent. We have people watching that. We'll monitor that. We'll bring some of the questions in if they're relevant to the conversation. If not, all your ideas will be used as we package up our media package at the end of this whole thing. So encourage you to do that. So hey, let's
jump in. I just, because I mentioned before the wisdom of the founders in this area. And I thought, my own view of foreign policy is like, irresponsible sex. It's best to be avoided or terrible things happen. But I want to quote Washington on this from his farewell address. I think these are words of wisdom. And I want to distinguish between being concerned about the well-being of people in the world. So yes, we want Doctors Without Frontiers, we want foreign aid, we want to help people, but most of the time that's been a cover for treachery. As you mentioned Vietnam, the original flood control advisors who were the way we intervened. So it is what Washington said in his farewell address. Our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world, taking care always to keep to ourselves by suitable establishments on a respectably defensive posture. He said, harmony, liberal intercourse with all nations are recommended by policy, humanity, and interest. But even our commercial policy should hold an equal and impartial hand, neither seeking nor granting exclusive favors or preferences, consulting, this is important, the natural course of things, diffusing and diversifying by gentle means, these are the words of a general, by gentle means the streams of commerce, but forcing nothing. And my own view is people who get into this foreign policy world can never resist the temptation to force everything and to decide they know better, even about countries that they barely could find on the map 3 months before we invaded it. And I think that the very structure of foreign policy, and I'm saying this as an old-timer, has been one of irresponsibility. And you could take any one of the major chapters of the post-war period, and you'll see nothing but ignorance, arrogance, hubris, and so forth. And I don't think we should dignify it by assuming that there are adults watching the store or that they care a damn about the rest of the world. They don't. And that's true just about every country in the world, not just our own.
Okay, the fundamental insight of Washington is informing this whole thing. But before we get into the policy implications about that, which I think is a good way to put it, let's just talk a little bit about what we really think looking ahead are the actual security threats. I mean, what are we really going to be facing? I mean, a lot of our current kind of way of thinking about foreign policy and military policy is informed by a lot of legacy thinking. So what I'd like to do is just kind of go around a little bit and get various people's hit on what really they see looking out. I mean, what are the things we should just be thinking about, worrying about, and actually structuring our policy around? Charles, do you want to start to jump into that?
Sure. So I'm if I have any expertise, it's in military policy, but you'll note when I'm top 3 threats to the United States are global environmental destruction and climate change, inequality and the secondary effects of inequality for security, ours and others, and third, regulation of international finance and corporate behavior. These would be at the top of my agenda for our foreign policy. And then finally followed by the problems of reactionary extremism, both religious and secular, and the potential for the construction of big power blocks and hardening of attitudes of conflict. And we need to especially focus on power sharing with China in that regard.
So you kind of gave a good overview of your kind of short list. Do others want to just talk a little bit about a specific one and go in more depth, or actually talk about their kind of overview as well, maybe a collection of thoughts? Heather, do you want to jump in?
You know, agree with the threats that Charles pointed out. I think another way that can be useful of approaching this question is rather than to start from the end of what do we have to be scared about, is to start from the end of what should the U.S. be trying to do? What should security policy writ large be for? And so you can start from a very broad level and say it's about the security of our citizens, of our people. It's about our economic security, and it's about our institutions. And sort of once you think about that in a positive sense, you can ask yourself, does policy X, Y, or Z promote those things, or does it end up undermining them? And there, I differ rather dramatically with Robert in that I think you meet enormous numbers of people of goodwill who have tried their very best to do what they thought was right for their country in the U.S. and in other governments around the world. Very often where we have differences and where we frankly have debates that are very much underinformed is in understanding and in being able to have a broad enough and long-term enough view to understand, is policy X or Y actually helping out those interests, or is it not? And then I think the last thing I would mention, which moves us toward more specific challenges, is to the extent that we now live in a thoroughly globalized world, working with others to solve problems is inescapable. And the problem with that is that it often requires you to care about or be interested in things that you wouldn't necessarily rank as your own top-tier interests. And the U.S. has actually historically had trouble sort of both ways, that we get too involved and don't know when to back off of other countries' fights, but we also have the temptation not to get into places where the U.S. has the ability to do things that would actually, again, help our own core interests as well as those of other countries. So that's what I would say on a really general level.
Good intro. Go ahead, Bob. You wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to disagree with Heather rather profoundly. The reason I quoted Washington is he talked about engaging the world. They cared about the world. They read about the world. They studied the failure of other systems. They were not provincial, and they were not ignorant. What they were was wary of military adventure, military intervention. There's not only nothing wrong, obviously we have to cooperate with the rest of the world. We can't have a situation which we once had where we were 6% of the world's population consuming 60 or 70% of its resources. Obviously, we have to beware that there are other actors, other players. You can't deal with, climate change. You can't deal with any of the issues that Charles mentioned that are all valid if you don't do so in a cooperative way in which you say there's a common human interest in solving these problems rather than a nationalist one. But that's not the issue. I disagree with the assumption that we have gotten into the foreign policy adventures because of misplaced goodwill or so nonsense. We had a Sino-Soviet dispute going back before there was a communist China, back to the 20s. Russia, there weren't two communist governments in the world that could get along, and yet the geniuses that ran our foreign policy based it on some kind of notion of an international communist conspiracy with a timetable for the takeover of the world. It was a lie from day one, whether it was applied to Guatemala or Iran or Vietnam or any other place. It was a joke, and anyone who had done any matter of months of study would have known it was a fraud, yet it was continued. You mentioned you worked with Warren Christopher, a fellow I interviewed a few blocks from where I am now in downtown LA. I loved the guy. I thought he was great, but he got swindled when he went into the government. Look at the origin of this religious madness now. It goes back to our policy under Carter following that, wild man Zbigniew Brzezinski, that somehow we had to get rid of the Russians and their influence in Afghanistan. They were backing a secular government. We then said all these religious fanatics that we could recruit from all over the world, they were going to save the situation. So I don't see a rational, thoughtful impulse in any of these foreign policy adventures. I
Well,
think it's been a
okay,
scam, and
but
it basically goes back to Eisenhower's warning that there's a military-industrial complex. People make a lot of money. Careers are built on this, and we end up with idiocy. So I don't want to dignify it with the notion that somehow there are good, thoughtful people making sound decisions. No, there are knaves making irresponsible decisions and getting millions of people killed.
Well, okay, that's a perspective, but honestly, for the sake of this conversation, we got to think about, honestly, what would a more positive American foreign policy that would have people executing it who are really genuinely trying to serve the interests of America, American people. Let's just, at least for the sake of this conversation, not so much get caught up on what happened in the past, but actually be thinking what would be the kind of foreign policy we'd like to see and the American people would like to see. And I think Heather and everyone would agree with that.
I just want to mention, by the way, because it's current right now, the Daily Beast this morning has a big article saying a lot of these experts in the government, right, this is the Obama administration, are just thrilled that Putin has intervened in Syria and he's going to get into the quagmire again. And they're happy about that. They're happy about the madness. They think, oh, Muslim fanatics will now attack Russia. Putin will be in trouble. It's the same kind of stupidity that got us into Afghanistan in the first place under Jimmy Carter and then followed with a vengeance by Reagan. So it is timely. And the fact is these people are using foreign policy as a way of playing with the world, and that ends up inevitably being destructive. And this has nothing to do with being engaged with the world. Be engaged with the world, yes. Deal with problems in a non-military way, but the military option is inherently destructive.
Okay, good point. But we need to move on to other folks, including the other Robert, who we're going to call Bob. Naiman, jump in on this one.
So first, I wanted to say I strongly agree with Heather that I want to be wary of taking threats as the starting point. Partly because it doesn't acknowledge, it's as if, we might be looking at the wrong threats without noticing that we are maintaining the wrong level of threat mobilization. We face no threat that's like the threat of Nazi Germany. We face no threat that's of the same magnitude as the threat of Soviet Russia, which you could argue was exaggerated, but it was exaggerated. But even to the extent that it was real, and it was real, was of an order of magnitude different from the threat of Al-Qaeda, for example. And everybody in the establishment knows this. So the idea that we should move from one threat to another while maintaining the same level of threat mobilization is harmful, because if it's an emergency, you do different things. And if you're under an existential threat, you do different things and behave in different ways that you should not behave in if you're not under an existential threat. And part of how we get into using a military force, and a lot of military force, is behaving as if we're in an emergency when we're not. And obviously that's not just a mistake. There are interests that benefit from that kind of mobilization. But if we don't want to have that kind of mobilization, we have to fight that both on the intellectual level and fight against those interests. And we can also think in terms of, if you're not in a state of emergency, then you can afford to have a longer horizon and think, okay, I don't have to spend all my resources on immediate threats. I can, or immediate opportunities. I can build for long-term opportunities, deal with long-term things, avoid threats in the future that will save me money and costs and resources and human life by taking advantage of these opportunities now. So, and I think that's the direction in which things can improve. I also think that it's a good starting point to think about the period since 2000, the period in the Obama administration. What were the biggest disasters from the point of view of most Americans inside and outside of Washington? The Iraq War was the biggest disaster. And we think about someone like Robert Gates, saying, the Republican Secretary of Defense in both Bush and Obama administration, saying that any future Secretary of Defense who recommends a land war in Asia should have his head examined. I think we should nail that to the church door and realize that although there are a lot of things that we want to change, should want to change, we don't have to start over completely from scratch. We should, the first order of business, I think, is defending what many people learned in the last 10 years and make sure that we don't go back to the world that created the Iraq War. We saw in Libya, we saw in Syria that some of the same habits, some of the same arguments were made, and in some cases were effective or not. And also that, although I certainly wouldn't hold up the Obama foreign policy as the utopia to which I aspire, if we look at the political landscape in the United States today, if we look at the landscape of Washington, that represents progress that we should defend. The fact that the Obama administration has tried to avoid major military commitments of a lot of troops and a lot of bombing has been more cautious, and there's been a tremendous pushback, and is now tremendous pushback. We're in a period now of political threat against the limited ground that has been won. And to me, that should be a top priority, not just the utopian direction we want to move, but defending the limited learning that took place as a result of the Iraq War. To me, that's a top priority.
So let's move to basic Gareth. We haven't heard from yet, but I do want to thread out here. I mean, I understand that people are starting to shift. Hey, let's move from threats to opportunities, which is awesome, and we will be moving into that next here. But still, don't you think there are new kinds of threats? I mean, let's just take climate change as an example. That could be seen as going to be causing potentially a lot of security threats and threats to livelihoods and all kinds of things that might be more front and center of a foreign policy. Any thoughts on kind of threats that weren't 20th century, clearly were not 20th century threats, that we might actually have to rethink in a more fundamental way? But Gareth, do you want to jump in?
Sure. You're absolutely right that climate change and other environmental degradation represent a global threat, which really is so long-term, involves future generations as far as one can see into the future, and therefore automatically should be promoted to a position of the top of the hierarchy of threats that the United States should deal with in a rational way. But I think what this group is hung up about, understandably, is this whole question of whether we can divorce ourselves from the status quo system of policy making and talk about reinventing, if you will, a new foreign policy without having analyzed correctly and talked about what needs to be done about the existing system of policymaking. And there I sympathize very strongly with what Bob Scheer said, although I would add that I understand where Heather's coming from when she attributes goodwill or well-meaning intentions to the policymakers. But you know what? A former National Security Council specialist named Morton Halperin, who has written some of the best, most insightful things about foreign policy making, once said that the problem, or one of the problems, is that policymakers always conflate their own personal and institutional interests with the national interest. And those interests are often, I'm not sure if he said always, but I would say virtually always, at odds with one another. The fact is that that the policymakers have represented constituencies, political constituencies, social constituencies, and institutions which have their own vested interests, and that has skewed policymaking systematically for decades in the direction of choices that have created disasters. Let's face it. I mean, you know, the Iraq War fits that description. The Vietnam War fits that description. All of the drone wars fit that description. So, I mean, I think what we're dealing with here is a systemic problem that we can't really overlook. And what that means to me is that the greatest threat that we face now, that we will continue to face until things are changed, until we reinvent the system, is the threat that we pose to ourselves, in the sense that the national security system, the system of policymaking on national security, automatically is skewed in a certain direction. And until we change that, until we reform it or revolutionize it, we will continue to face the same problem. So I think that's why Bob is putting such emphasis on George Washington's words, which I think are well taken.
Terrific. We're kind of moving into a section on the policy. What are the answers? And I think it's good. But actually, Heather, you wanted to jump in here a little bit on people, kind of the thread that's been talking here, but also you had some thoughts on real new things, new threats.
Great. No, I think it is absolutely true, and it is unfortunately a feature not just of the American political system, but of human nature, that human beings given some power tend to conflate their own interests with the interests of the broader society that gave them the power. And Peter, I may be jumping very far ahead in your schema of how this conversation works, but ultimately, I actually think the answer to that is going to be more oversight and getting us back to, you know, frankly, the kind of public interest in oversight that we had for a brief moment in the early to mid 70s. And then, of course, in a different way, we had during Washington's era when, you know, the circle of politics was much smaller and many of us were not allowed to participate in politics. So on the one hand, it was a lot easier to oversee the decision makers if it was only white male property holders. But we do need very urgently in this sphere to work out new oversight mechanisms that can help us rein in the inevitable tendency to conflate one's own good, one's institutional good, the good of the company that gave one a job the last time one was out of office, et cetera, et cetera. So having said all of that, I find it's just deeply offensive to hear Americans who risk their lives to go to Africa and treat people with Ebola last year, or somebody like Chris Stevens, who was out, you know, trying to talk to ordinary Libyans, trying as hard as he could to bring diplomacy to the fore in Libya, use less security. It's just deeply offensive to characterize those people blanket as knaves. And frankly, that kind of thinking, I mean, it feels good to say, oh, the problem is they're all bad, but it doesn't actually help us solve the problem. So shifting off of that to the question of new threats, I think, you know, there's a tendency to want to get all excited and say, oh, climate change is different from anything we've ever faced before. And of course it is, because humanity has never gotten itself in quite such a hole before. But the best attributes of the international system and of American contributions to them, like, for example, setting up the United Nations, have come when the U.S., when we were faced with unprecedented challenges and at least some element of U.S. leadership for somewhat self-interested reasons, but ultimately those are the best kind because you'll actually follow through on them, determined to actually find new ways of working together globally. And I think, you know, Peter, the reason we're struggling a little bit with the construct you have here is that talking about threats and security is very much a paradigm that we all think we know what it means. And we think it means let's talk about Afghanistan, let's talk about Vietnam, let's argue about drones. Where, you know, in, what is it, it's not even a month now, the Paris climate talks, which, you know, won't have any, there won't be any guns, there won't be any bullets, there won't be any missiles, there won't be any troop movements that you can draw cool little diagrams of on the internet, but we'll either fail to marshal, or most likely come up with something that's just barely the lower bound of adequate resources to start dealing with this threat. But we're not used to, even those of us who think of ourselves as the alternative, we're not used to thinking that way. So, you know, it's not so much the problems that are new, it's our need to reinvent or get rid of some old habits about how we approach the space and what we think is most important.
I love that frame. That's an interesting frame. Well, how about others feel about that? I mean, so it is really, what are essentially what you're saying is don't think about the threats, think about the opportunities. Think about where we need to go as a nation, where we need to go as the world. Is that safe to say, the kind of shift you're pushing about?
Yeah, I mean, I know that sounds like a cliche, but both Americans do better when they're given something hopeful to think about. And the more we can avoid falling into a trap that's very well set up for us, and Charles actually commented on this on the comments, and I'm now going to call him out and hope that he'll talk about it. The risk that we run is that we know really well how to move any issue, how to turn any issue into a security issue, and how to hand any issue off to the Pentagon to be dealt with. And Pentagon is very good at breaking things, killing people and breaking things. If we don't think the way to fix something is to kill people and break things, then we don't want to frame it as a security-based threat, because our society has built a straight conveyor belt to the Pentagon for it.
Awesome. So let's go to Charles. Oh, sorry, Charles wanted to jump. And then we'll go to Bob and Robert. Sorry. But Charles, you wanted to jump in because she was teeing you up.
Yes, thank you, Peter and Heather. So reflecting back on the set of, or my security concerns that I named, 5 of them, I want to first mention that since the end of the Cold War, we've seen a huge militarization, surprisingly, after the end of the Soviet Union, of U.S. foreign policy. And one measure of that is that there's been roughly the rate of deployments of U.S. military has been, on average, 4 times that of the Cold War period during the last 25 years. And 6 times the rate of the previous 125 years. So this is a high rate of militarization of U.S. foreign policy. Now, turning to how do we talk about opportunities? Well, we need to have a politics that can talk opportunities. I mentioned regulation of international finance and corporate behavior, attempts to deal with international inequality, national inequality in this country, and the secondary effects, which are quite important for security, and of course climate change and environmental destruction. There are huge opportunities for this, but we have to free up resources, we have to free up attention, we have to change the politics of national security and foreign policy to do this. And I'd love to hear us talk more about how do we change the politics in this country so that this can happen. I see very little in Washington, even among those progressive Democrats who are kind of missing in action most of the time regarding much of this. So I'd just like to open up discussion about.
Yeah, Bob Naiman, and then Robert Scheer comes next. But let's go, Bob. Why don't you jump in?
Well, I think it's remiss to have this discussion without mentioning the Iran nuclear deal. We want a positive example of something that just happened that involved using diplomacy rather than military force, that was multilateral, that used the United Nations as well as Europe, that worked with Russia, that worked with many countries, that where Pentagon wasn't doing zero, but it was in the background, helping to create space for diplomacy to happen, where there were multilateral sanctions. Not that every aspect of that was wonderful, but overall the story was that it did enough to allow diplomacy to work. So I think it's a mistake to think that we don't have anything positive and recent to point to, saying that we could use something other than military force. We did just use something other than military force to solve a problem which was judged to be significant, which some people were demanding that we use military force for, which would have been a disaster, and which other people, at least outside the United States, maybe even still some people in the United States, see as a model. Europeans thought, wow, this was great. What else could we do with diplomacy? There's multilateral talks happening right now in Syria. Nothing on Syria. Nothing totally wonderful to report yet, but we're talking to Russia, we're talking to Iran, which we weren't doing before. The Omanis made a practical proposal to try to have unity government between the Syrian government and some parts of the opposition. So, and you could see a path to that coming to an agreement which would substantially reduce the violence in Syria, de-escalate between the U.S. and Russia, and maybe even de-escalate between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Not saying that this is about to happen or that the prospects are very good, but it's plausible. It's plausible. The civil war in Lebanon was ended through diplomacy and agreement. The civil war in Syria could be ended through an agreement, which would save a lot of lives and prevent a lot of human suffering and have secondary benefits in terms of de-escalation. So, let's talk about what just things that we know were feasible because they just happened, things that look feasible because they're part way to happening, and not keep everything on the level of abstract structuralism.
Robert Scheer, go ahead. Yeah, that was good, Bob. Go ahead, Robert.
I think Bob, the other Robert, has outlined is a very good point from which we can maybe move to some consensus. I don't think we're in fundamental disagreement. And I also applaud what Kerry has done. I think the distance between Kerry and Hillary Clinton is enormous in terms of their vision. I think the opening to Cuba and the negotiation with Iran are worthy of a Nobel Prize. I think this is I'm somebody who supported Obama, too uncritically, I think, in retrospect. But I think Kerry is providing a model, and I applaud it. And when I say knaves, by the way, that doesn't mean people in government can't do the right thing. I think even Gates, who, after all, in his own book, said we went into Afghanistan before the Russians did, and he's emerged from his foreign policy experience quite critical of some of the hawks and so forth, can learn. But the point is that going back to defending those white property male owners that gave us this system of government, there was a wisdom to them, and I think they learned it from looking at what happened to Rome, what happened elsewhere, and that was a suspicion of power, and suspicion of power tied to nationalism. And I think it's a wisdom that we should not abandon. And the idea was basically when they gave us these rights that our current administration, along with its predecessor, is interested in violating, like the Fourth Amendment and a robust view of the First Amendment and, and Seventh and Eighth and others, they said you have to be on guard against government, not some foreign government. You have to be on guard against the government that we are forming and are going to lead. Okay, that's the caution in our constitutional system. And if you ask me about America's role in the world, we ought to cherish that tradition. We ought to cherish the idea of individual freedom, individual rights, an informed public making decisions, and a healthy suspicion of people of power. And protection of those institutions like a free press and the rights of the citizens to individual sovereignty that inform that. I think it's the great contribution of the United States, the fact that we have it written down in a wonderful constitution, yes, a growing constitution, but nonetheless basically an incredible document. And I think in terms of our place in the world, that's what we should stand for. And I object to the language that's being used about threat. Threat immediately implies a military problem. It immediately summons up an idea of force, and it inevitably gives rise to threat inflation. And it gives rise to the demonization of others. So instead of seeing climate change as something that, first of all, we contributed to massively, in terms of our overconsumption and waste of resources, but now we're going to blame it on developing nations that are trying to catch up and so forth. That's the wrong language. We have worldwide problems of income equality, racism, religious fanaticism, and so forth. and yes, climate change, and we have to address them in a spirit that does not rely on the military option, does not demonize the others, recognizes our common humanity. And after all, in terms of the knaves in government, it was Martin Luther King who said that his government, terribly sad to say it, was the major purveyor of violence in the world today. That was King's statement, and he was calling our attention that we are very often the threat. Our hubris is the threat. And I think we should recognize that. We are major players in this world. And what I am arguing is not against engagement. If you mentioned, yes, it's great that we went to Africa to deal with the Ebola, but why were we so reluctant to acknowledge the leading role played by Cuba? After all, it's Cuban doctors who were most effective on the ground in dealing with that crisis, and we were loath, and so was our media, to actually acknowledge that, because we're still in the mode of demonizing Cuba, and they did. So I would say the major task in international relations is not one. I don't believe in disengagement out of concern for the world. We can't disengage because we've been the source of some of these problems. For instance, the financial crisis in the world, those collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps and all that garbage came out of our deregulation and our shipping this stuff to the world, and you can see that. And a lot of the other problems, we are players in that. But what I'm talking about is recognizing that the jingoistic military option increases the problem, and that we have to have a different way, and advocating that different way is not naive, it's actually the ultimate realism. And the sad thing is we have very few voices. On the Republican side, I thought Rand Paul, some of the libertarians would advance that position. They've been weakened. They clearly don't represent a major force. On the Democratic side, it looks like Hillary Clinton, who's given to a truly hawkish stand, as far as I can find out from looking at what's come out of this administration. She was more aggressive than President Obama in intervening in the Mideast. She's hardly represents a force for peace. So I don't see anything in this election. Even somebody like Bernie Sanders seems loath to bring up some of these thorny foreign policy issues. Israel hardly gets made. We're having this discussion at a time when Netanyahu visits the United States. Hillary Clinton had a piece in the forwards of the Jewish publication praising Netanyahu, and she even mentions the death of Rabin without mentioning that was something done by someone who was on Netanyahu's side of the whole thing.
Well, that's okay. So that's exactly why we're doing this roundtable and this series, you could actually say. So what we're going to do is exactly that, to open up a different kind of conversation around foreign policy and to shift it from the kind of patterns that we've been in. Gareth, you want to jump in here and both build off of Robert's point and also Heather's, my understanding. And we are moving now through the kind of opportunities, and let's let go of all the threats behind us. Go ahead, Gareth.
Right. I want to agree with Bob's invocation of certain things that have been done by the Obama administration, specifically the use of diplomacy with regard to the Iranian nuclear issue. That in itself is something to be defended. Yes, absolutely. At the same time, I think we should recognize that the Obama administration, from 2009 until 2013, first 4 years of that administration, was actually carrying out a policy of quite self-conscious policy of diplomatic coercion, which is different from diplomacy. Diplomatic coercion meaning that the United States was carrying out various kinds of pressures on Iran, including the threat of Israeli attack, which the United States was invoking in its diplomatic contacts with various states, the pressure of cyber attack against Iran's not only the Natanz facility, but also its oil and gas industry, as well, of course, as the threat and actual practice of severe economic sanctions against Iran. That was really the Obama administration's strategy for the first 4 years. So I think it was much more deeply embedded in this culture and the institutions of coercion, then we certainly want to hold up as a model for the future. And I think so. That brings me back to the question of the need for fundamental change in the way policy is decided, national security and foreign policy is decided. And Heather mentioned the need for more oversight. That's fine, except that I think it would be a huge mistake to count on the existing institutions for oversight. They are, if you talk to anyone who has followed the congressional oversight over the intelligence community or over military policy or foreign policy, it's really totally ineffective. I mean, the congressional leaders and the relevant committee leaders are clearly part of political systems that are not willing to exercise any meaningful oversight on the excesses of the national security state, including the surveillance state. So I think this brings us again back to the fundamental problem that we have to have institutional change before we can realistically think about the possibility of moving away from what has become really, we all I think agree on this, the permanent war state, a state of permanent war. And so I would like to, in this discussion, offer 3 principles that I think would be helpful in moving to that kind of fundamental change. The first is to recognize that not only are military policy and foreign policy indistinguishable, they really are one package, but military policy is something that is highly institutionalized. Military strategy and posture are highly institutionalized. It is produced by the Pentagon and the military services with a relative minimum of political involvement on the part of outsiders. That has always been the case. It still is the case today. And the military policy that we've had really skews foreign policy in particular directions. For example, regime change was not something that was invented by a few neoconservatives, as I think most people believe. In fact, it was President Clinton's first defense secretary, who came in 2009, who said that in his first posture statement that the United States should have the capability to carry out wars that are not vital interests, but that would involve the change of regime for those states that are considered rogue states. So that's really the beginning of regime change, and it was codified and, of course, institutionalized ever since then. That's a fundamental problem. Secondly, it's the availability of military capabilities that also skew policymaking. We know, for example, the future Secretary of State, then UN Ambassador Madeleine Albright in 1993 famously asked, well, what good is it to have all this military power if we can't use it? She wanted to use it for the Balkans, to carry out a war that I think was really not necessary in U.S. interests, but typifies the idea that a lot of civilian policymakers have. So I think we have to think about military capabilities that need to be removed in order to remove the temptation and the incentive to go to war, because that will continue otherwise. And finally, I think we again have to take into account the reality that the interests of the national security institutions in programs and policies that favor their own vested interest are at odds with the interests of the American public, the American people. And this has been shown over and over again in recent years. And so I think we need to use that fact, we need to raise that fact as a way of trying to bring about change. And I think that should be at the center of our discussion.
Well, you've now moved into the final section, which is exactly right. I mean, so what is that, that new kind of foreign policy? I mean, we've talked a little bit about here there's been pieces of it emerging here, getting more oversight, somehow shifting away from the military state, other aspects of global integration, potentially other institutions. But why don't we talk a little bit about that? And Heather, you wanted to talk up a little bit about breathing into this new kind of foreign policy. And for everybody here, what is a cooperative, different kind of collective action foreign policy as opposed to the more militaristic one? Oops, you're muted, Heather.
On that up to now. Agree 120% with Gareth that oversight in the national security foreign policy arena is really at a crisis point right now, and that underlines, something that Charles, I think, said at the beginning, that the first step in having a new model of foreign policy is going to be to have a new, more effective model of domestic policy, and one that really updates our institutions, reflecting both how many different voices there are in the policy arena than there were in the 1950s or the 1780s, first of all. Second, there's a fundamental, we have this idea as Americans of, using some of the Washington quotes that we heard from Robert about gentle persuasion and not moving the streams. When you have the world's largest economy and have the world's largest military, you're just not going to be able to be gentle all the time, and that's a fact that I think progressive critics of American foreign policy are uncomfortable with, but we've got to deal with. And that brings me to something that Gareth just said, which is, yes, our military and non-military external engagements with the world are irreparably intertwined. We're never going to be able to separate them. Many of us might secretly wish that we could, but we can't. Just as, by the way, we haven't talked about the economic side very much, but I can't disentangle a doctor treating Ebola, the military ship that brings that doctor, and the pharmaceutical companies that are pushing the planks they're pushing in international negotiations so that they can make the amount of money they make while they create the drugs to treat Ebola. So we're stuck with this package that runs in the channels that it runs in because of how our economy and society are set up here at home. So, fundamental revision of how we see ourselves and how we see our society relating to the world, which is, sort of not very satisfyingly specific on policy grounds. But so then if you just to sort of throw out a couple of quick specifics, one is more money for diplomacy. One is more attention, all of us, making a conscious effort as we talk and write to highlight diplomacy, to highlight all kinds of non-military engagement. Us progressives, instead of spending as much time, even as we did in this conversation, beating our breasts about the military, to try to move on to, well, for example, Ambassador Ford had this great piece recently, 5 things or 3 things that should be being done on the diplomatic side in Syria, and you can push on that whatever you believe should or shouldn't be being done on the military side. But we as thinkers and advocates, frankly, could be leading a lot more in having modeling the kinds of conversations that we want to see evolve. And also, one very last thing. We've got to stop having these conversations among white people over 45 who are mostly men. The people who work for me have had a dramatically different set of experiences, have a different set of tools that they're used to using. And I mean, I'm not naive enough to think that they have magic answers that we don't have, but their understanding of the tools and the challenges, and since they're the ones who are going to have to live in this world that we make, that is part of the solution, really democratizing the way we do this work.
Terrific. Charles, jump.
Thank you. I'm hoping we can spend some time talking about how do we shift the politics of this stuff a little bit. I've observed American foreign policy since the Vietnam War days pretty closely. I've seen with very short intervals of some change, mostly stasis in our foreign policy establishment. Foreign policy, in my view, is one of the least democratic parts of our governance system. things are tightly controlled and kept that way by a small elite. Heather referred to white males. Of course, there are some females and there are some people of color involved, but by and large, white males who go to certain elite schools, are taught in particular doctrines, realist doctrines about sort of a nationalist orientation to foreign policy and the essential needs to advance U.S. interests almost exclusively globally. And if there's going to ever be real change, we need to talk about how do we get a different set of people into the foreign policy world. How do we begin to have conversations and a discourse on a broad level of change and so forth? And I'm a little pessimistic at this point in my life when I see how few political leaders are willing to take any risks and move anything along in terms of a real difference along these lines. So if others have sort of more optimistic scenarios where we could see change, I'd love to hear it.
I have, I think, two optimistic things that I can say. One is the question on oversight. The War Powers Resolution is good law, and everybody who cares about this stuff should take some responsibility for telling the American people that the War Powers Resolution is still a law, good law, and is not dead, and was used to good effect in 2013 for Congress to intervene, and that, I think, helped us get the agreement with Russia on serious chemical weapons instead of using military force. So that's something we could do something about right now, like the ACLU says about the Constitution. Constitution doesn't defend itself. War Powers Resolution doesn't do anything by itself. We have to be the agents for that. The other thing I think is that we'd all like to live in the world of Washington and Adams, but we don't. And there I agree with Heather. In particular, we have to take responsibility for the fact that in the post-World War II world, the U.S. has special relationships that we are just, as a practical matter, not going to walk away from and go back to our farm. We have a special relationship with Germany. We have a special relationship with Japan. We have a special relationship with Saudi Arabia. We have a special relationship with Israel. What I think success looks like, in the Iran nuclear deal, Obama pivoted the U.S. relationship with Israel and Saudi Arabia. And we're still friends with Israel. We're still friends with Saudi Arabia. But the friendship is a little different, and that's a big deal. The ship moved, and he took a lot of flack for that. So you're talking about politicians' courage. He took a lot of flack for that. And we can pivot more. We can pivot more. And if we get this Syria deal, that's going to be another pivot with Saudi Arabia. And again, as Representative Himes said, that's not going to look like a perfect agreement from the point of view of Washington, but that's going to save a lot of lives and prevent a lot of human suffering. And why shouldn't we sing that from the rooftops? No.
I think Gareth has a kind of counterpoint on that. Gareth, do you want to jump in, and then we'll go to Robert Scheer?
Yes, thanks, Peter. I really dissent very, very strongly from the idea that there are sacred cows that we must not think about tampering with in U.S. national security policies, such as the power of the military or the U.S. relationship, let's say, with Saudi Arabia. I mean, these are two things that we not only can change to the extent that the work is carried out to prepare the ground for it, but that we must change to have a policy that reduces the threat to the United States from the very forces that the U.S. has unleashed itself on the world and on the American public. And I'm sorry to say that the Obama administration's relationship with Saudi Arabia is far from changed or diminished the ties with the Saudis that have bound the United States. On the contrary, the Obama administration has gone much farther than previous administrations in accommodating extremist policies on the part of the Saudis. So, I mean, this is one place where I would say we must, in fact, move decisively in the opposite direction. The United States needs to establish a set of principles about alliances. And one of those principles needs to be that the United States will not cooperate militarily with states who commit certain kinds of who violate international law, who violate the laws of war, who unleash policies of sectarian violence in other countries outside their own borders that threaten the prospect or the specter of greater terrorism that could threaten the lives of foreigners or of Americans. That is precisely a description of what the Saudis have done, for example, and we need to draw a line. We should be drawing a line against that kind of relationship with any foreign country. We don't need it. We don't need their oil. We don't have to satisfy them in order to have access to oil. That's not the case. There's not a sound reason for this. This should be one of the planks of a reinvented foreign policy.
Good point. Hey, Robert, now we're going to shift to Robert Scheer, and these are all good points, and they're all kind of evolving and kind of meshing together in a kind of a more coherent foreign policy. But one thing to be thinking about is, if we thought out 10 years to a very different kind of foreign policy, are there any pieces of that kind of foreign policy that we haven't really brought out yet? We've talked about various aspects of what that foreign policy might look like, but are there ones that we're missing as we kind of head towards the end here a little bit? Robert, we would want to hear from you a little bit on that.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me address the age question. I can't help being a bit older, but I went to Vietnam to report on it back in '64, '65. I was lied to earlier by the Kennedy administration. I was lied by the John. I've been lied to by Democrats and Republicans. I've interviewed quite a few of the people. Some of them, at the end, like Robert McNamara, admitted that this was a disaster. I think there are very few people around who would defend those previous adventures. I just happened to look at an old article I wrote for the LA Times in May, the first before the Al-Qaeda attack, where the Bush administration was giving money to the Taliban to help in the war on drugs. That was seen as the big fight, and of course we were cozy with the three governments that recognized the Taliban, one of which was Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, and so these so-called experts and everything were totally ignorant, and that they were still living with the idea that somehow these maniacs that we have recruited from around the world and brought to Afghanistan as freedom fighters weren't, they could still be dealt with in some way. That turned out to be wrong, and then we had this tremendous overreaction. I want to disagree very seriously with Heather's point, which is that we need to have half of the world's military power, that we need to be that kind of nation. I think this is the sickness, frankly, that Washington did warn us against, and so did General Eisenhower. I would like to see this country be more of an ordinary country. Because first of all, we're setting a very bad example. What are we saying to China? As you now move to become the second biggest economy, should you build up all your strategic weaponry? Should you be intervening militarily? Should your secret police agencies be overthrowing governments and so forth? Should the Russians regret that they're no longer a communist power? Should they go in another more authoritarian direction, build up their military, which they seem to be doing, show that you can be a player on that field? Is that the world we want to move to? And I think it's a very dangerous way to think about American exceptionalism. To me, American exceptionalism, it goes back to the wisdoms of the founders, and that was a notion of limited government power. And that doesn't mean, the reason I quoted Washington, it doesn't mean you're not concerned and a participant in human endeavors around the world. but your emphasis is not on the military. And I want to be very clear about that. I think it's pie in the sky to think you can have a representative democracy of any kind of significance and have a big military establishment. I've spent my whole adult life covering what are basically the lies of that establishment, whether they're Republicans, whether they're Democrats, whether they call themselves liberals or conservatives. They ended up lying with impunity. And then you get the documents. We just last year got the key document on the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran that started this whole idiocy with Iran. And finally, there's the smoking gun document kept from us because secrecy is the norm. And what does it say? Oh, we've been asked by the British secret government agencies to overthrow this guy, not because he's tied to the Soviet Union, not because he's a communist, but because he's nationalizing oil. And the Iranian, Anglo-Iranian oil company finds that a threat, so we should overthrow this guy. You know? And there you have the whole madness of Iran. And increasingly, we look at what's going on in the world. It's the same as always. And what is this big situation in the Mideast? We decided that somehow we had to get rid of defang secular dictators like Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, and now in Iran, Assad. And why? Because we're going to find something better. And we, in fact, unleash worse forces in every one of those places. And we create this great worldwide refugee problem. We get a lot of people killed. So I don't see that changing. And what you have not addressed, I don't think you can, this is the point Washington made, be an empire and be a representative republic in the same moment. You will never have an informed public. You can lie to the public about everything. The Clinton administration lied about China and Wen-Ho Lee, a thoroughly decent scientist at Los Alamos, and they kept him in solitary, they kept him confined under lights, clean lights and everything for 9 months to try to drive him crazy, proving that somehow China had stolen our great nuclear secrets, which was hogwash. And if you look at every one of these adventures, they've been based on lies. Not just the Iraq War under Bush. You look at what happened to the Gulf of Tonkin? We didn't get those documents for 20 years. There never was a second attack.
Okay.
The whole justification was a lie. And you could sit here, I could go through 50 examples of that. So, yeah. You're basically trying to construct an imperial national security state that somehow is inherently democratic and responsive to the people. And no. The people will be lied to. That, by the way, is the point of 1984, which we should be considering right now. What Orwell was warning about is it can happen here. And if you're going to constantly have demons outside, you're going to constantly play the national security card and keep that alive, you're not going to have a representative society.
Okay, Robert.
If you want a youthful role model, Edward Snowden, who was 29 when he blew the whistle on these people. He was part of the government, and he told us the truth. It's not a truth that Hillary Clinton, Dianne Feinstein, or anyone else told us. We didn't know what our NSA was doing, except there were a few whistleblowers who dared to tell.
Hey, Robert, we got to, with the time here, we got to basically shift to, let's hear from Heather, because honestly, I don't think Heather is really promoting that piece, although you're framing it in a way, really not what she's saying necessarily, but let's give her a chance to actually say a few things in the end here as we're starting to wind down. Go ahead, Heather.
Thanks. Yeah, well, a lot of things got said there that I didn't recognize myself in the attack. And I will say that if progressives can't among ourselves have debate where we attribute goodwill to each other, then we really have no hope of modeling for our country or any other country how we can transform things. I want to make a realist point, which is that the U.S. is a large country, a phenomenally wealthy country, and a country that, because of things that have happened up to this moment, has a very large military, a large alliance system, and a large role in the world. So those are things that are, and the question that you have is what you're going to do with those things. That's just a sort of a realist approach. I add to that my particular brand of idealism when thinking about this stuff is that to those to whom much is given, much is demanded. So the challenge that I see for the future of American foreign policy is, we're not the sole superpower. We're not the only pole of the world. We're not many of the things that we like to tell ourselves that we are, but we do have a lot of resources and potential for good for ourselves and others that nobody else has, and we've got to start from that as a starting place. Now, you asked, Peter, what could foreign policy look like in 10 years? And I wanted to mention some specific positive things that we could think about constructing from, that we could think about how can we make more of the future look like this. You know, Bob Naiman mentioned the Iran deal, which is certainly an example of how you use your diplomatic and your military assets, how you use some very realist coercion with some very idealist blandishments to work together. Other things we've done, global health. It was announced today that there were only, I think, less than a dozen cases of meningitis in 2013 in Africa after a major vaccination effort spearheaded by the UN's World Health Organization, to which the U.S. was for a long time the largest donor, remains one of the biggest donors. Similarly, polio, which we both led work to eradicate and then shamefully undercut by letting U.S. intelligence agents masquerade as doctors giving polio vaccine, which is an appalling thing that happened and that there hasn't been responsibility held for, but that doesn't take away the good that the U.S. also did. If you look at the European Union, a continent that 50 years ago people were not sure wouldn't pitch us back into a third world war on the spot. Now, think positive and negative about different aspects of the European Union, but U.S. security support for that grouping allowed it to emerge independently and become an independent competitor to the U.S. That's a wonderful model for how you can use security and diplomacy together. Miraculously, nuclear weapons have never been used again since the U.S. used them in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That has a lot to do with American leadership. What worked about that? What can work in a new environment? And last, I'll mention something that may be the most unpopular thing I've said yet, that we've actually seen some successes in preventing and ending wars. Côte d'Ivoire, where the U.S. supported a UN Security Council and French intervention that actually stopped a civil war after it was breaking out. East Timor. The Balkan states look a heck of a lot better than many other places in the world, despite the popularity, unpopularity, dubiousness of those interventions. So there are some things that we know how to do when we work with others, when we have a broad base, when we have oversight, and I would just say build on what we know works.
Wow, a lot to be said there. Now look, we're unfortunately towards the very end here of this conversation, and so we don't have enough time to really continue to build on this. A lot of great ideas, and we'll be parsing them through, actually develop things later. But we do have time for one last go around for everybody, and what I'd really encourage everyone to do is just to kind of in a short period of time, everyone has kind of about a minute, let's say, or a little that or a little bit more. Just kind of tell, if you had to leave one thought with the audience and one idea of what we should be doing built on a new kind of foreign policy, maybe leave that with us, or even any final insight on what you kind of saw emerge from the conversation here today. And let's start with Robert, or Bob Naiman, who wanted to jump in here, and you also wanted to say a little something on this current conversation, but then maybe you could flick it into your summation, and we'll go around the table then.
Okay, so I'll bridge this way. I'll say that to me, what happened was that was Bob and Heather against Robert and Gareth, where we were attacked. We're like trying to deal with the real world and what could we realistically do in the next while. And I think that for me, like Gareth, Sacred Cow, you don't know anybody who has done more things to try and change the U.S. relationship to Israel in the last 30 years than me. I was in Israeli prison. I was on the roof of a Palestinian house that the Israeli army was about to destroy. I was beaten by Israeli soldiers. I was kicked out of the country. I was kicked out of Bahrain. So I'm not in the Sacred Cow camp, but I am in the what can we realistically do camp. And my fear is that by portraying the choices, I would love to have an Irish foreign policy, Norwegian foreign policy. I hope I live so long to have that be the foreign policy for my country. But my fear is that by presenting the choices as what we have now versus utopia. I have no dispute with your utopian vision, but that is not on the menu in the restaurant right now, tomorrow, next month, or next year. So if you present that as the only two choices, I fear the choice that we're going to get is what we have now, and miss the opportunities for changes that can happen realistically in the next while, like the Iran nuclear deal, like the Syrian Accord, like changing these relationships somewhat so that we have less war. I think that is realistic in the next while. So please don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Please don't portray, I think, realistic reforms that could happen in the next while as the enemy of the long-term utopian vision.
Okay, Gareth, we just have a little time for just your kind of summation. It's a lot of controversy here that's interesting. What would you have to say in your last minute out?
Yeah, I'm glad that Bob posed the issue in that way. I think that is the right way to define the question that we face. What can we realistically attempt to do as people who understand the disasters that U.S. foreign policy has inflicted on the world and on the United States? And my point, and I'm sorry that I haven't had the opportunity to really expand or explain this, is that we must educate the American public about the degree to which the national security state has not carried out policies or made decisions on the basis of the national interest, but have acted in their own narrow vested interests, whether it's political interests or institutional interests, and the results speak for themselves. But we must delegitimize the nature of the decision-making process in order to be able to create enough pressure to bring about change so that we will not have a constant repetition. Not constant in the sense that we're going to have another war in another 2 or 3 years that's like Iraq or Afghanistan, but that over time that the system will indeed replicate many of the kinds of policies that we've seen in the past in some form or another. So really it is a choice as to whether we're going to work at more fundamental change by trying to educate people about why we've had this permanent war state emerge.
Okay, great. Charles, your last kind of thoughts in a minute or so?
Sure. Yeah, I'll end with a little story. I was involved in work in Europe, Western Europe by and large, but also reaching out to the Soviet Union in the last few years of the Cold War. And I was involved in something we called non-offensive defense. And this was a notion that it was very important for countries that had some kind of conflict with another to show mutual regard for the security needs and concerns of the other nations. And as I said, most of my work was in Western Europe. We were trying to get NATO to change its military policies regarding offensive weaponry and tactics and so forth. To my great surprise and to the happy surprise of the world, I believe Mikhail Gorbachev took up these ideas and decided to pull back his troops from Eastern Europe, and thus the beginnings of the end of the Cold War came about. We need a national security policy and a diplomatic policy that routinely honors the security needs of other nations and takes that into consideration, and that's a major reform that I think we should be looking for. Thank you.
Nice reflection. It can be done. Big system change. Robert Scheer, your last thoughts in a minute or so? Robert, you're muted right now.
I think that this idea that somehow the national security state can exist and somehow can be democratic is utter nonsense. I think that we have surveillance on a massive scale. We have a foreign policy that is out of control. We've seen our country associated with torture, with killing civilians on a massive scale, wasting of resources, and a totally irrational foreign policy. We don't have adults watching the store. I think the majority of Americans have shown in polling they don't want to put boots on the ground. They don't want to get into these adventures, and they're constantly frightened and lied to about the need to do that. And so what we have now is a technical intervention. We bomb people without any trial. We have these drones. We've used our massive machinery because the American people will not support actual occupation. And so we actually have technically a very, very destructive policy. But the real victim here is the notion of American democracy, an informed public making rational decisions and being responsible to define its own security needs.
Okay, thank you for that final comment. And Heather, you have the last word here. Do you want to say something?
Well, I'm actually going to take the opportunity to agree with Robert that I worry enormously about how the growing size of the national security state, with the tools that it has, and the willingness of our political elites to yield power to it without oversight, is an enormous threat to our democracy. I actually agree with that completely. The point I would make about the way forward is that the set of tools and impetus and energy that the U.S. have enormous potential for both good and ill, and have been used in the past for good and ill. And so if we look at U.S. foreign policy as all bad, that's just as much a problem as if we look at it as all good. And if we look at some actors as all bad and other actors as all good, that's not going to get us where we want to go either. So, the way forward in American foreign policy, as in American democracy writ large, is to give all of our fellow citizens credit for being rational actors, for making the best decisions they can with the information they have and within the systems they have to work, and frankly making sure we spend more time communicating across military, civilian, expert, non-expert, elite, non-elite, in government, out of government, generational boundaries to think about what it is we want to be doing, how it is we want to be doing it in the world.
Terrific, and thanks so much for that final word, everyone's final word, and a terrific conversation. There's a lot to be said. We tried to pack a ton in 90 minutes, rethinking fundamentally American foreign policy. We touched on many, many great ideas, good themes, and look forward to what we'll come up with the highlight package, and some of the pieces will come out of this. I'm sure they'll be rich. And do come back for the rest of the series, which will take different pieces of this and go much more in detail. Thank you very much, and thanks for all our participants, too.